what I thought I would do for 20 minutes before we give it up to Nick, and Nick can talk to you a bit more about Darktrace, and what they do is try and give you guys a kind of a fairly high-level look into 3 trends as we see them, as I see them, in how things have developed recently in the internet infrastructure and the threat landscape. 3 trends that kind of inform our position. Our position being that we need to sort of move to a more behavioural anomaly-based approach to security. People like us often bang on about that to other people, and we evangelise about how we need to start moving away from old school models and thinking about behaviour, but I think we often don't do enough to try and ground that in examples and try and justify why we think that. So I thought I'd do that and be specific for a bit, if I can, without going too technical, as I said. So, to do that, I'm going to outline what I think, or one way of thinking about security traditionally, and then I'm going to try and give you 3 examples of 3 challenges to them. So, this is what I'm thinking of as a traditional approach to thinking about security, and as far as I can see, the main way of doing it, which is about thinking about it in terms of endpoints and classifying people into good and bad. So, here's us, and on a kind of simple way of thinking about things, thinking about network security, we interact with various other entities out there. It doesn't really matter what they are. They can be people, they can be devices, they can be hardware, they can be software. We're interacting with other things out there, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And on this kind of simple way of thinking about 2 endpoints talking and them being good or bad, the problem or the question of network security kind of boils down in this case to how do we decide when a new person comes along whether they're in the good camp or the bad camp? How do you make that call? How do you classify the endpoint as good or bad? And there's properties of those endpoints that we can use to do that. And these are your standard things like IP address, host name, what is it? Is it a web server? Is it an FTP server? Who owns it? What's it done in the past? Identity claim, which is a bit of an odd one. That's stuff like certificates, who it purports to be. And obviously that's not remotely an exhaustive list, but I take those to be probably the main, or some of the main IOCs that we use when we're trying to make this decision. And so the idea here is, right, that these properties are valuable if we're trying to make this decision and classify something as good or bad. And that once we've done that, we can use that to inform our approach to security throughout the entire security process or lifecycle, right from one end, from avoidance and before the fact. We can use this way of thinking to inform that behavior. We can say, if we think of there being good endpoints and bad endpoints, then we can avoid talking to the bad ones and only talk to the good ones, and we can remove risk that way. And then you can think about it in the sort of during phase of security. You can say, we'll use this as our way of thinking about how we should block things and how we should do access control. And then we can have it as an after the fact, a way of trying to spot things when you've been compromised. Or can we see us talking to any bad endpoints? Or does everything look good? So I think I take this way of thinking to be quite pervasive throughout the entire approach to security. And so I'm going to give you 3 challenges to this now. 3 different phases, as it were. One in the before phase, one during, one after. And these are malvertising, certain use or abuse of the cloud, and a certain use of social media platforms. And these are quite high level, but I'm going to try and make it specific because I think these, rather than being some particular attack that happened last week, I take these to be interesting changes, quite fundamental changes that actually have a real impact on that model that I talked about. So the first one then, malvertising. I hope most of you guys know what malvertising is because it's a real passion of mine. I despise it, and I think it's a real problem for the web. So what it is a buzzword for malicious advertising, and it's really come into its own in the last few years on the web. What we've had over the last 5 years this explosive growth in this ad serving and tracking infrastructure on the internet, right? All these ad partners and the metrics companies that put what are called pixels into pages, and they all combine together into this big infrastructure which is designed to couple you up when you visit a website with all their third-party content and all the gatherings of information about you and serve you ad bins. And this has become this massive underlying churning substructure of the web that is very prevalent, and the bad guys have started using it. So here we are, and we connect out to our entity again, and this entity way of thinking about things, and this is some kind of trusted site like CNN or The Guardian or Amazon or something, and we connect to them, and then they redirect us to all their ad partners. And there's a whole slew of them, and those app partners will redirect us to their partners and their partners' partners, and it's a many-stage deep process. And then somewhere down the line, at the end of that, you will get served impressions of adverts, and most of them are good, and some of them are bad, because the bad guys will sneak in. And so what's happened here is this big, complex, many redirects stage of kind of infrastructure has coupled you up with bad stuff when you thought you were just going to visit CNN.com. So, not making this up. Last year, these are some of the domains that are doing this, just picked out of a long list. As you can see, you don't get much more reputable than this. There's places you would think you'd be safe on the web, and obviously it's still going on. In some reckoning, it's the fastest growing or the biggest security problem at the minute. This year we've seen a new campaign, and yes, they do use 0 days. So this isn't just trivial stuff. They're not just phishing you with pharma spam or trying to do click fraud. If you get redirected from these websites, chances are you will be compromised because they hook you up to exploit kits, which are nasty things themselves. So what does this mean? This means that this undermines the trust model. What I mean by that is we have this idea of thinking about the internet and having a notion of trust informing what we do on the web. So we know things about websites. We have that list of properties that I put up at the start about entities, and we can use those to make a decision. What do we know about this person we're talking to? Are they good? Are they bad? What's their history? What's their reputation? What have we seen them doing in the past? And in this way of thinking about things, you have control. You know who you're going to talk to, and you can pick and choose when you go on the web, and you can take steps to stay safe. But this is taking away that control from you, because you no longer have any real way to avoid risk, right? So you can't say, I'm going to go on the web and I'm going to stay safe. In a way, you now have to think that when you visit any website in the web, no matter how good they are, in effect, you're visiting the whole web. You're being confronted by the whole of the internet every time you go there. And this does kind of sadly mean, and maybe we can discuss this if people don't agree with me, but I think this pretty much means compromise is inevitable when you go on the web. So, yeah, not good stuff. Not good stuff when thinking about how you should inform your behaviour in terms of good and bad guys and making decisions about what you do based on property development. So, next example for you guys, in terms of thinking about in that during phase, how can we use this idea of good and bad guys to access control stuff and prevent things. So here we are, and on our first model we connect all these different granular endpoints out there. The internet is a nice big mesh of lots of people talking peer-to-peer around there, and then now in our new model, the new brave era of the cloud, everyone talks back to big amorphous blobs, big centralized services. It's quite a radical change in the topology of the internet, actually. It's quite a collapsing down of this very distributed model to a centralized model in a few places. I think people aren't really thinking enough about what that means for the internet as a whole, but for security, I think it has some big impacts. So the cloud has done great things for security in many ways. It allows small companies and new businesses to leverage Amazon's enterprise-grade security type stuff, but obviously it's flexible, it's a powerful tool, the bad guys are using it, as they will do. So the bad guys are in the cloud. You connect to the cloud, and yes, it's full of good people, but yes, there are bad people in there. How many bad people? Well, a lot. I'm going to pick on AWS here just because they're the biggest, not because they're especially bad, but this is what happens when you offer a great service to anybody. From last year, some stat, 41% of all malware hosting domains were in AWS IP space, and not quite as worrying a stat, but still kind of bad. On this reckoning, 20% of exploit-based web attacks came from AWS, and 10% of SQL injection attacks came from there. So that's not good. There's a lot of bad stuff lurking in the cloud. So what does this mean? Why is this a problem for this? Well, the cloud takes away visibility, because in that original picture where we were connecting direct to all these different endpoints, we knew who we were talking to. That list of properties was very specific, and it was tied directly to the entity we wanted to know about. But now the IP space is AWS. Now the domains are usually subdomains of the cloud provider you have. Now the reputation and the history is blurred because there's churn. They reuse space. There's different people hosting in there all the time. So as an analyst, as someone who looks at this stuff, when you're trying to investigate, have I been compromised, you're trying to write rules, it's very challenging because you go, oh, it's AWS, great. Now what? Don't really know. It becomes a lot more difficult to use those kinds of properties to make decisions. You have to start looking for other ways to do them. Makes it very hard to do attribution, which is a big part of the security process. It makes it a lot easier for criminals to hide in there, and this means, as I said, that we need to find other ways to stop bad guys. So that list of properties that are tied to endpoints become much less valuable when they are the properties of the cloud providers rather than the individuals. Okay, third example for you. Use or abuse of social media. So, in some ways this is nothing new. It's happened with forums for a long time, but it's got a lot worse. The social media platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and this. What I mean by this is in the post-compromise phase, right? Bad guys in your network, they're either in there as a human presence or they've got malware in there and they have to call home, they have to exfiltrate stuff. That's not a contingent property of some attack campaigns, that's a fundamental property of attack, right? You have to call back, that's not going anywhere. So here we are, and in the olden days, if we're compromised when infected, we might spot that, we might realize that by seeing us talking back to somebody who we've classified as bad. Based on the properties of the endpoint, we would know that we were infected because that's a bad person. But why do that anymore? When there are these software as a service type platforms, these big communal pools like Twitter, and here we are, and we're talking to Twitter all the time. So you're a bad guy, just blend in, just go to Twitter. And this is what happens more and more. These are being used for botnets, for exfiltrations, for command and control. So this is, as long as it goes 2011, we had a Twitter mining, Bitcoin mining botnet where the bots are being controlled through tweets. And it's still going. Here's a different example for you. It doesn't just have to be the big platforms, it can be any old blog people are using. This is very recent. This is one of those alleged Chinese threat actors, APT-17, who have been using Microsoft Forum recently to control a botnet. Again, not quite the same as Twitter, but the same idea, shared communal place where people can submit content. So you don't go back to your infrastructure, just use the shared infrastructure. So what does that mean? Well, this is even worse in the cloud case. This isn't just a blurring over or a slight loss of visibility into who's good and bad. There is no bad guy here, right? It's just two good entities talking to each other. So if you're thinking about security in terms of good and bad people, you've got no hope here because you just can't do it that way. So you can look at the content maybe, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but there's nothing necessarily suspicious in the content. This example, the Twitter Bitcoin mining one, was a bit suspicious. They just did very straightforward, garbled-looking ASCII encoded characters, and they sent strings of them for their command and control. That looks suspicious if you're looking at the content, but it doesn't have to be. That's just limited by the imagination and the care of the attacker. You can make this look very much like English text, and you can exfiltrate stuff very subtly through it. So you have to do something else, and this is what happens when you no longer have good and bad guys talking, you just got good guys talking. You have to move away from properties of individuals and you have to start looking at properties of connections. What I mean in this case is you have to use things like how often these happen, right? We have to say, we always connect to these two endpoints, so the endpoints are pretty useless to us, but often normally we connect at certain times of day. Often normally we only do these sorts of behaviors, and now if we do frequency analysis and we use timing and we use sizes and we use frequency, we can start to say, oh, okay, this is a change in behavior. It's still Twitter, the endpoints are the same, but it looks different. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Generally then, the idea that I'm trying to gesture at is that this model doesn't work so well, or it's getting less useful, because these properties are being kind of devalued in terms of their abilities when we're making security decisions. We are less able to use those to inform our choices and avoid risk, because things like advertising are collapsing down the internet and picking things up, so you don't really have control anymore of who you talk to. The cloud, which I take to be a fundamental change in the infrastructure, the topology of the internet, is meaning that more and more of these properties are less the properties of the people you want to know about, and they're more the properties of intermediaries in the middle. And shared platforms like social media mean that if you want to exfiltrate stuff and you want to communicate with each other, you don't have to talk anymore directly, you can just talk to intermediaries again who are good. So all of this is taking us away, it's severing these links and giving us no visibility into the people we're talking to. So what do we do? If these properties aren't very useful anymore, and we can't classify these people into good and bad, and we just have two entities talking, how do we make decisions about it? So we have to look at other things, other ways to think about bad and good, rather than the people. One way is the content. So this has always helped us. Lots of traditional IDS rules look and do pattern matching in the content of what is said between these two people who don't care about who they are, but what they say. It's challenging. There's all the problems associated with writing SIGs and knowing what to look for in content. It's also technically very difficult. It's almost prohibitively difficult to do anything like complex pattern matching, anything more than a very simple string on full packet content for the kind of throughput of data that big organizations have. That's just very difficult. but more fundamentally, I think it's not the future, because encryption is the future. Encryption is not going anywhere, and everything's getting more and more encrypted, and we're losing visibility into content. So in the same way that those properties of endpoints are becoming less valuable, this is going to get less valuable. Your advanced malware sandboxes are very useful, and they're great, and they will look at the content, but more and more of the stuff that you want to know about, you don't have any of that visibility into content, so you can't rely on that. So we look at metadata things, facts about what happened. We don't know anything about the people talking, and maybe we know something about what they said, but let's look about the facts about it. Things like the when, how often, how much, stuff, the frequency analysis stuff. Those are the properties we look at. They're not that valuable, really. They're okay, they're a bit sparse as a data set, they don't tell us that much. They're not really rich. It's quite hard to make decisions based on just that stuff in isolation. So what we can do is we can start to pair them up and use them to do comparisons. And this is really what we take to be the only way to deal with this, the future of security, is in anomaly detection, because you have to use these properties and you have to find a way to spot bad stuff using them. So there's two broad ways to do that. One is by comparing behavior to behavior, right? So now, instead of us talking to loads and loads of different endpoints out there, we don't care about who we're talking to, it's the web, it's the internet. We're talking to the whole thing, we don't really mind. Let's not get granular on that. Let's look at the connections, and let's use those kind of who, what, when, where, why properties about the connections to try and compare between our connections and say, okay, let's look at us, let's look at what we do. Let's not worry about who we're talking to, and let's say, what can we say when we compare this to our other behavior over time to make this one look interesting or different to us. And maybe that way, if we do that well, we can start to spot bad patterns in behavior. Or we can compare people to people. That's another very powerful way of doing it. Again, we don't care about endpoints, it's just the whole internet infrastructure collapsed. But now there's usually a lot of us in an enterprise, so we can look at each other and we can say, well, what does that guy do? What does he do? And so we can spot bad stuff by saying, this guy looks different to the other guys. He's doing something different. Again, we don't care about who we're talking to, we don't really care about what is said so much, we're just looking at what we do and looking for patterns and changes in that. So, the takeaway from that, the kind of idea that I want to impress on you is this, that as we lose visibility into endpoints, we have to replace it. And the right way to replace it is by increasing visibility into yourself. So, we don't have control over what we know about other people on the web, things are changing that for us. The underlying topology of the internet is making it more difficult for us to know about who we're talking to, but we can know more about ourselves. So let's inform ourselves and replace that information by gathering data on ourselves and saying, what do we do? Let's leverage the information we have about us and our own behavior and our peers and use that to try and spot bad things and keep ourselves safe. And that's the approach that we take. That's why we partnered up with Darktrace, because Darktrace is a product that allows you to do that kind of thing. It allows you to profile your behavior over time into other people and use that when, how often, how much data to really get value from it and actually start to spot bad things with it. And we think that is really the only way to fight these kinds of changes. And I've given you the examples, but there are others. This is just part of the way the internet is changing, and it's changing very quickly. So I think that's all I want to say to you guys. I think it would be appropriate for Nick to talk to you a bit about Darktrace and what they do, maybe, with that background of what we think the